Vivien Leigh passed away on July 8, 1967, in her London apartment, her life quietly claimed by a recurrence of tuberculosis, a disease that had haunted her for years, just as fame once did. She was only 53, a two-time Academy Award winner. But behind the glamour was a life ravaged by mental illness, emotional distance, and personal sacrifice. Leigh was a woman who gave everything to her art, her youth, her health, even her child. She was married twice, most famously to Sir Laurence Olivier, in a union as passionate on stage as it was tormented in private. And while the public saw the radiant star draped in silk and spotlight, few knew she was also the mother of a single daughter. What happened of the girl raised in the absence of Hollywood's most tragic legend? Below is the story of the only child into Vivien Leigh. Suzanne Leigh Holman was born on October 12, 1933 in London, to a mother who was only 19 years old. That mother was Vivian Mary Hartley, not yet the famous Vivien Leigh, but already restless, already ambitious. She had married Herbert Leigh Holman, a stern, older barrister who disapproved of her theatrical aspirations. He wanted a proper English wife. Instead, he got a woman who gave birth to their daughter and almost immediately began plotting an escape into the world of stage and screen. As Suzanne took her first breaths, her mother was reciting Shakespeare in front of a mirror. When Suzanne turned 1, Vivien was performing in small West End plays and starting to appear in modest British films. Her screen presence caught attention quickly, and by 1935, just 2 years into Suzanne's life, Vivien had adopted a new stage name and a singular focus: fame. Meanwhile, Suzanne remained with nannies and her paternal grandmother, quietly raised in the background of her mother's rising ambition. By the time Suzanne was 4, Vivien's career collided with destiny. She met Laurence Olivier, fell deeply in love, and began an affair that would ignite tabloid headlines and professional fireworks. That same year, Vivien's performance as Ophelia opposite Olivier's Hamlet marked her breakout moment. In 1938, Vivien crossed the Atlantic to chase the role of Scarlett O'Hara, and won. She became a global sensation, transforming before the world's eyes. While Suzanne remained in England with her father, she would not be taken to America. She would not attend the film premiere. At just 5 years old, Suzanne became the child of a legend in real time, but without her mother at her side. While Vivien worked 16-hour days on the Gone with the Wind set, battling fatigue and perfectionism, Suzanne was learning her letters at home, reading about her mother in magazines she couldn't yet fully understand. The two lives, one glittering, one quietly unfolding, had already separated. Vivien Leigh was no longer a 19-year-old mother. She was a star on the rise. And Suzanne, born at the very start of that climb, would grow up watching the silhouette of her mother vanish into history. As Suzanne entered her teenage years, the woman the world knew as Vivien Leigh was no longer just a movie star. She had become a myth. By the early 1940s, Vivien was the wife of Sir Laurence Olivier, an Oscar winner, and one of the most celebrated actresses in the English-speaking world. But to Suzanne, she remained a distant, elusive figure. Their relationship existed mostly through letters, elegant, careful notes that arrived from hotel suites in New York, Paris, Rome. "My darling," Vivien would write, often attaching pressed flowers or photographs from film sets. But love on paper never replaced presence. Suzanne was growing up under the guardianship of her father, shielded from the chaos of her mother's life, but also shut out from it entirely. While her classmates bragged about siblings or mothers who volunteered at school, Suzanne carried a different weight: the unspoken burden of being the daughter of Vivien Leigh. There was no escaping it. Her mother's face was in every magazine, her name etched into film history. After a second Oscar for A Streetcar Named Desire in 1952, Vivien's fame hardened into legend. Yet at home, Suzanne watched from the margins. Her mother would sometimes visit, always with gifts, always glowing and manic. But she never stayed long. She had plays to rehearse, interviews to give, premieres to attend. Their time together felt rehearsed, like scenes from a play Vivien couldn't finish. There are stories of Suzanne quietly pulling out old photographs of her mother during school breaks, staring at them in silence. She wasn't trying to remember, she was trying to connect. In her boarding school years, Suzanne kept a box under her bed filled with Vivien's letters, as if trying to build something whole from fragments. In one note, Vivien wrote, "You are my anchor, even when I drift too far. But even an anchor can be forgotten when a storm takes over." Vivien's struggles with bipolar disorder were growing worse, though they were rarely spoken of aloud. Suzanne, still a teenager, sensed the instability in her mother's tone, in her unpredictable visits, in the eyes that sparkled one day and hollowed out the next. Fame had consumed Vivien Leigh, and in its flames it left Suzanne standing on the edges, a daughter looking in at a mother who had become more image than woman. The world adored Scarlett O'Hara and Blanche DuBois. Suzanne was just trying to figure out if she still had a mother behind all that applause. As Suzanne moved into adulthood, the world expected her to follow a path carved by blood and legacy. After all, how could the only child of Vivien Leigh, a two-time Oscar winner, the eternal Scarlett O'Hara, not step into the spotlight? But Suzanne chose otherwise. Quietly, deliberately, and without fanfare, she walked in the opposite direction. There was no press release, no rejection speech. She simply disappeared from the public eye, choosing a life where her mother's name did not precede her. While tabloids speculated on Vivien's next role or her turbulent relationship with Olivier, Suzanne enrolled in school, built friendships untouched by celebrity, and began shaping a private identity far from the shadows of theater curtains and camera flashes. She married Robin Farrington, a businessman with no ties to the film industry, a safe harbor from the volatility she had grown up witnessing. Together, they settled into a quiet life in the English countryside and had 3 sons. Suzanne didn't seek magazine covers, premiere carpets, or interviews. Instead, she became the kind of mother Vivien never had time to be: present, grounded, steady. There's no record of her ever trying to act, no auditions, no mention of drama schools. And that silence is loud. It wasn't a lack of talent. It was a refusal to inherit a burden masked as a gift. In some ways, Suzanne's choice to step away was an act of quiet defiance. She knew what fame looked like from the inside, how it devoured schedules, strained marriages, and cracked minds. She had seen her mother glow under stage lights and then collapse into depressive spirals behind closed doors. She had lived through Vivien's manic highs and devastating lows, watching as bipolar disorder took more than it gave. Fame had given Vivien immortality, but it had cost her stability, motherhood, and peace. Suzanne learned early that the spotlight could be as cruel as it was intoxicating. Still, the comparisons never stopped. Friends would mention her resemblance to Vivien. Strangers would whisper at gallery openings or charity events, "That's Vivien Leigh's daughter." She smiled politely, nodded, and then moved on. She never denied the connection, but she never used it. There were no tell-all memoirs, no interviews on morning shows, no documentaries narrated in her voice. She didn't perform grief when Vivien died in 1967. She grieved privately. She didn't fight for legacy. She preserved it from afar. But even as she built a separate life, the echo of Vivien's presence never fully faded. Inside her home were locked drawers filled with her mother's letters, jewelry boxes with old trinkets, and fading black and white portraits Vivien had sent from abroad. In moments of reflection, Suzanne likely wrestled with the inevitable question, if I had chosen differently, would the world have made space for me, or would it have crushed me beneath her shadow? Her life was a quiet answer to that question. She didn't become the second coming of Vivien Leigh. She didn't try. Instead, she built something entirely different. A family unburdened by myth, a legacy not of art or applause, but of presence. In doing so, she proved that sometimes the most radical act in a famous family is choosing normalcy and living it well. The turning point came in 1967. Suzanne was 33, a mother of 3 boys, living in the quiet rhythm of English suburbia when the phone call arrived. Vivien Leigh was dead. Tuberculosis had returned in the early summer, and within weeks, it claimed her life. She died alone in her London apartment on July 8th, her body discovered by a longtime partner. The headlines swept across the globe. The star of Gone with the Wind has fallen. But Suzanne, once again, was not part of the picture. At the funeral, she stood at a distance, barely acknowledged by the press, swallowed up in a crowd of actors, producers, and dignitaries. The real shock came later when the terms of Vivien's will were made public. Much of her estate, including personal letters, jewelry, and royalties, had been left not to Suzanne but to Jack Merivale, Vivien's final partner. Suzanne received a modest inheritance, but what mattered more was what she didn't receive. The archive, the voice, the memory bank. It was a subtle erasure. Not legal betrayal, but emotional exclusion. She wasn't disinherited, not entirely, just quietly, strategically, left out of the story. For Suzanne, this wasn't just about material loss. It was a final confirmation of what she had always suspected, that her mother's true family had been the theater, the critics, the roles. Her childhood had been sidelined, her adolescence filled with silence, and now her adulthood marked by absence and legacy. There was no Hollywood tribute that mentioned her name. No published obituary that called her survived by her daughter. In the eyes of the industry, Vivien Leigh had died as an icon, untethered, unmothered, unclaimed. The wound ran deep, but there was no public outburst. Suzanne didn't sue. She didn't write a memoir to correct the record. Instead, she returned home, closed the door, and raised her sons with an even firmer grip. But those closest to her noticed a change. She grew more reserved, more guarded. Family friends later recalled how she stopped talking about her mother entirely for years. It was as if, after Vivien's death, Suzanne had to seal that part of her identity to keep living. A defining image of this chapter remains. Suzanne in a gray wool coat, standing outside her mother's flat on St. James's Square, a few days after the funeral. No reporters left, just silence, her face unreadable. Not grief-stricken, not enraged, just still. A daughter without a stage, a woman watching the last curtain fall, and realizing she'd never been allowed backstage. In the years that followed Vivien Leigh's death, Suzanne Farrington faded from public view almost entirely, and by choice. While film historians, biographers, and collectors obsessed over every frame of Gone with the Wind or A Streetcar Named Desire, Suzanne remained silent, almost invisible, as if guarding something no one else had earned the right to touch. She never gave interviews. She never wrote a book. Her sons say she rarely spoke of her mother, and yet, in quiet, personal ways, she became the final curator of Vivien's legacy. It wasn't until decades later, in 2013, that Suzanne reappeared, not as a celebrity, but as a steward. She and her children opened the family's private collection to Sotheby's, unveiling hundreds of unseen artifacts, annotated scripts, handwritten letters, rare photographs, and personal keepsakes. It was the first time the world glimpsed Vivien Leigh not as a myth, but as a woman, complex, flawed, brilliant, and heartbreakingly human. That gesture, done without spectacle, reframed Suzanne's place in the story. She hadn't rejected her mother. She had preserved what mattered most in silence, and waited until the noise died down to share it. Suzanne passed away in 2015, just shy of her 82nd birthday. She was surrounded not by journalists or studio executives, but by the family she had built herself. 3 sons, grandchildren, and a legacy built not on applause, but on intention. She left no autobiography, no memoir, no demand to be remembered. But those who knew her say she carried a quiet dignity, the kind that doesn't ask them for credit, but earns it anyway. In the grand mural of Vivien Leigh's life, Suzanne is not the centerpiece. She is the frame, sturdy, silent, and essential. She was the only person who truly knew the woman behind Scarlett and chose never to perform her. But Vivien Leigh's story is only one thread in a far more intricate tapestry, a world where the glow of greatness often casts the deepest shadows at home. Beyond this singular bond of mother and daughter lie countless other stories, heirs forgotten, voices muted, truths left out of the official scripts. In the episodes ahead, we'll step into those quiet rooms and fractured bloodlines, where the children of Hollywood's brightest stars wrestle with everything the world chose not to see. If you don't want to miss what comes next, subscribe to Legacy Uncovered and join us as we reveal more untold lives behind the legends. Thank you for listening.